Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brianna Walden. I'm in External Relations with the Charles Koch Institute and also an alumnus of Hillsdale College. So really glad to be here with you guys today for this exciting event this evening. As a graduate of Hillsdale, it's always a good opportunity. Really love coming out here to the Kirby Center and want to especially thank Dr. Matthew Spalding and Hillsdale College's Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship for co-sponsoring this event with us tonight. As the more than 2,500 alumni of the Charles Koch Institute's educational programs could tell you, we welcome scholarship, debate, and analysis of crucial public policy issues like those we'll be hearing about tonight. As part of our work to foster productive dialogue among diverse groups on critical topics, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest installment of our author event series, The Butcher, the Brewer, and the Baker. Through these events, we seek to highlight the work of individual authors and engage a broad audience in dialogue about the importance of free societies and how they increase well-being for the overwhelming majority of people. Tonight's featured book is What Adam Smith Knew: Moral Lessons on Capitalism from Its Greatest Champions and Fiercest Opponents, edited by Dr. James Otteson. Dr. Otteson is the Executive Director of the BB&T Center for the Study of Capitalism and the Thomas W. Smith Presidential Chair in Business Ethics at Wake Forest University. He received his Bachelor of Arts from the University of Notre Dame and his doctorate from the University of Chicago, where he also has, from his bachelor, he has a cool Hillsdale connection as well, where he was roommates for a year with the beloved Dr. Brad Berzer, which, if there's any Hillsdale alum in the audience, probably will agree with me, so you can ask him about that later. He specializes in political economy, business ethics, the history of economic thought, and political philosophy. His most recent books are The End of Socialism and the one in your hands, What Adam Smith Knew, an edited collection of primary sources. This book seeks to explore the intersection of morality and capitalism through assembling seminal readings on the nature, purpose, and effects of capitalism as understood by its most influential expositors, both historical and contemporary. Dr. Otteson draws from his rich understanding of an array of thinkers to arrange readings that highlight the ways that capitalism bears on a set of fundamental human concerns: liberty, equality, social order, virtue, and motivation. Here to interview our guest author is Vice President of Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute, William Ruger. Before joining the Institute, he was Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at Texas State University and an Adjunct Assistant Professor of Political Science at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, at the University of Texas, Austin. Ruger earned his doctorate in politics from Brandeis University and Bachelor of Arts in Government from the College of William and Mary. Among other publications, he is the author of a biography on Milton Friedman and co-author of Freedom in the 50 States, an index of personal and economic freedom. Ruger is also a veteran of the Afghanistan War and officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve component. Please join me now in welcoming both of our guests this evening for tonight's event.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Brianna, and thank you all for coming to, I think, what will be an interesting discussion, at least on Jim's side. So I'm really excited about this. You know, Jim and I have had, we were joking, have had this type of conversation dozens of times, just without as many people here to see it.
Usually over alcohol, and you still haven't learned all the things you need to learn.
Yeah.
Maybe tonight will be the night.
Yeah, well, at some point I might. But no, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how this goes, because it is a little bit different when you have people here, but I think it'll be exciting. And it's really suiting, kind of a real kind of suitable topic in this day and age, where a lot of these debates are front and center in our politics and in our nation. So welcome, Jim. And I guess we really want to start off with a question about what the purpose of this book is, What Adam Smith Knew. What is the purpose of it, and what was your motivation for putting it together?
So thank you very much, Will, and also it's a great pleasure to be here. This is my first time at the Kirby Center. I have visited Hillsdale College, B4, I'm afraid to speak. Am I doing that? I visited Hillsdale College before, but never the Kirby Center, so it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. The book grew out, so I teach in a business school, but that's a new position for me. My Ph.D. is in philosophy, and there aren't many philosophers in business schools. But one of the things, I teach at the business school at Wake Forest University, but one of the things I was interested to pay attention to was what got taught in these courses called business ethics in business schools. So just about every school, every business school has courses called business ethics. Usually they're electives. Oftentimes the students hate them. They're not really a central part of the curriculum. So I was interested to find out what gets taught in these courses. And so I've been doing a bit of a survey of what gets taught in these courses. And I discovered some things that were interesting to me. One of them is that there's almost no consensus across the people who teach these courses about what they should be about. There's no general view about what business ethics is, what kinds of things should be taught, what kinds of things you should study. Everything from the substance of the questions to the methodology of addressing the questions, there's almost no consensus. So this book grew out of my attempt to generate a certain kind of consensus. So if you're going to teach a business ethics course, I thought this would be a good start. So these are the readings that I thought could, if not be the sum of the course, could at least be central parts of the course.
Mm-hmm. So the title of the book is What Adam Smith Knew. It'd be make a nice bumper sticker, like what would Adam Smith do, WW, AD, ASD. But what did Adam Smith know? I mean, what is the central message of a lot of the works that are in this book by Smith himself about this important subject of capitalism and its critics?
It's a good question, fair question, especially given the title. So you might be surprised to know that one of the things that is often not taught in business ethics courses. So business school curricula are pretty good at teaching, as I put it anyway, they're pretty good at teaching the how of business, how to do finance, marketing, accounting. They're not very good at why. Why do we want to have business? What's the role of business in a humane and just society? Mm-hmm. Why would we want to have capitalism if we do? What are the arguments for that system of political economy? So what this book does, or what it attempts to do, is to answer that question, why business? So not the how of business, but the why. Mm-hmm. And what I say Adam Smith knew, what I had in mind by that is just a couple of main things. First of all, that this is not just a descriptive or positive question. It's not just how do different systems of political economy affect human life, but it's also a moral question precisely because different systems of political economy have effects on human lives. Mm-hmm. One of the most, for me anyway, one of the most inspiring aspects of The Wealth of Nations, for those of you who don't have your copy of The Wealth of Nations in front of you, it's a 1,000-page long book. It's a very long book with lots of interesting information and some stuff that's not quite so interesting. But right at the beginning of it, if you read the introduction to the book, which is just a page and a half long, mm-hmm. Smith right there announces what I think really is the important moral motivation for the book. So he talks about how in the Highlands of Scotland in his day, the book was published in 1776, which was an auspicious year, and the Hillsdale audience should understand that. That, of course, was the year in which David Hume died. Is that what you were thinking? It is the year David Hume died. Book came out in 1776, and what Smith says in the introduction to the book is right in his day, he has seen with his own eyes people in the Scotch Highlands, so Scotch in the Highlands of Scotland, who were so poor that mothers sometimes had to decide which of their infants or children to expose to the elements so that the others could eat. And when you think about that stage of human life and how much of human history has been marked by those kinds of decisions, it becomes a moral question. So Smith was writing at a time in the 18th century when some places were beginning to generate some wealth and other places weren't. So the real question about that book was why? Why are some places becoming wealthy and other places aren't? Mm-hmm. So when I say what Adam Smith knew, the first thing is that this is an important question, maybe indeed one of the most important, maybe the most important question of political economy, is what are the institutions? And that can be political institutions, economic institutions, moral or cultural institutions. What are the institutions that enable or seem to enable human beings to rise out of the historical poverty in which they've lived? And it is a moral question because that affects in a deep way the prospects of human life. Mm-hmm.
Now, many of the people in this room are familiar with Smith's Wealth of Nations. But he wrote another important book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And people throughout, since that time have asked, well, these sound like different Adam Smiths, or at least different depictions of human nature, or humankind. So is there an Adam Smith problem? Are there two Smiths? Or is there a single unifying theme in Smith's work that makes these two seemingly disparate books come together?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Smith, as you said, only wrote 2 books in his lifetime. The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which came out in 1759, and The Wealth of Nations in 1776. So only 2 books, hardly enough to get tenure in a modern university. He only had these 2 books. And the first book was about something regarding moral philosophy. The second book is considered by many, including myself, to be really the foundation, the beginnings of economics as a discipline. So the question that you're asking, how do these 2 books go together? In the 19th century, there was a series of German scholars who were reading these 2 books and decided that, well, there was some kind of schism that happened. You had these 2 different Adam Smiths, an early young Adam Smith who was motivated by some kind of idealistic view about the world in which people could be moral and maybe even think about others. And then he grew a little older and experienced some of the world, including, by the way, he traveled to France. And of course, everything goes south when you go to France. Understood that wasn't how the world worked. It's really some other kind of self-interested world in which we live. And so the 2 books, how do they go together? The German scholars gave it this very grave-sounding name, Das Adam Smith Problem. But what's interesting about that question is, and I think the reason you're asking is because, in a sense, it's still our question. The question is, how do markets and morality go together? How do markets and morality mix? Now, there's been a lot of ink spilled on this question for Smith in particular. A lot of scholars have written about it, including, for full disclosure, I have too. Arguably, I got tenure writing about that question. But I think the short answer to whether they go together is yes, they do, under this title of political economy. So what Smith was trying to do was understand what are the principles that, or the laws, if there are laws, that describe human behavior, human sociality. So he was very much impressed with the Newtonian revolution, what Isaac Newton was able to do for bringing together disparate phenomena, understanding them under a few simple rules that describe the regular behavior of movement of things in the heavens and also on Earth. Smith wanted to apply a similar methodology to human behavior. Can we observe human behavior, various kinds of experiments in human life, and infer from that rules that might regulate, that might enable us to predict how human beings would operate under different institutions. So I think you can see the 2 books as being an attempt to apply that sort of quasi-Newtonian method to 2 different areas of human life. The human phenomena of moral judgment making, which is a big part of what we do. In fact, arguably, we do that from the moment we wake up until the moment we go to sleep at night. We're judging all the time. We judge others. We're judging ourselves. This is an interesting phenomenon. And then on the other hand, this phenomenon of bartering and exchanging and trading, which is something else that human beings do. So Smith thought that these were natural features of human life, of natural features of human sociality, things we all do all the time. And he wanted to see if he could understand them and submit them in some way to a kind of empirical scientific analysis. So I think that's really the way the 2 books go together. They're subsequent attempts to apply the same methodology to 2 different but overlapping areas of human sociality.
Yeah, I mean, not to be too esoteric, but is this why some people think that the history of astronomy, another piece that he wrote, is related to actually his political thought?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I mean, we don't have to go into too much detail about that book, but about that essay. So another essay that Smith wrote called The History of Astronomy, in which he sketches a short history of this discipline of astronomy and physics. But what he does is he tries to elicit principles of scientific investigation. And what he says is that human beings are motivated to figure things out when they see that when they can't quite see the patterns in the phenomena they're observing. This happens, and then that happens, and then this happens. Do they have an underlying link? And so he talks about the development of science as being the attempt to figure out what the underlying connections between various phenomena are. And I think that's exactly what he's doing in both of those books.
Interesting, yeah. So let's go back to the Wealth of Nations for a bit. So at the beginning of the Wealth of Nations, he talks about the pin factory. and discusses the division of labor and what results from that. And one of his concerns was that as we specialize, we may turn into less interesting, more narrow, we might become a kind of useful idiot because of our narrowness. Smith worried about that. So if capitalism prevails and we all specialize very narrowly, do we have to worry about us becoming a less kind of humane society or less interesting individuals or leading less flourishing lives?
Yeah, it was a worry. It's a good question. It was a worry that people like Marx had. So Marx, who was a reader of Smith, Marx, as you may know, didn't spend a lot of time talking about what life would look like under the ideal communist regime. It was most of his stuff was a criticism of capitalism. But he does have a couple of lines where he talks about being a farmer in the morning and fishing in the afternoon and being a poet at night and a philosopher during the night. So this was sort of doing all of these various different things. Smith had a similar worry. George Stigler, the Nobel laureate from the University of Chicago, famously would say to his students that if you're going to teach The Wealth of Nations, you should don't teach Book 5 because Smith went insane in Book 5. So The Wealth of Nations has 5 books to it. In the first book, the 5th book is where he talks about all these problems about the division of labor. Right at the beginning. So the whole story, if you'll allow me for a second.
Please.
I can give you the whole story of The Wealth of Nations. Here's the edited version in 90 seconds. What's the explanation for why some places become wealthy and other places don't? Smith puts the conclusion of all of his analysis right at the beginning, so it's very convenient right at the beginning of the book. He says it's division of labor. Those societies that have institutions that allows labor to divide, what will happen is you have increasing production, and he uses this pin factory as the example. So if a person is making a pin, the little things that you get in your shirt box that you would now just throw away, well, in the 18th century, these were still luxuries. So if you make a pin from start to scratch, he said one person could make 1 pin a day. If you were good, you might make 10. If you were a master, you might make 20. But if you divide the operation into 10 different stations, so one person draws the wire, another person cuts it, another person shaves it, I don't know what all the steps are, puts the head on the top of it. He says those 10 people can make 48,000 pins in a day. So that's not just a little increase, that's a tremendous increase. So if you divide that by 10, so 10 people make 48,000 pins, or about 4,800 per person. That's something like, well, it's exactly a 23,900% increase from the division of labor. That's pretty remarkable. Now, I don't know if that's...
What about the jobs, Jim? Come on.
Yes. So let's assume that he was off by that number by half. It's still a pretty remarkable increase.
Yeah.
Okay, so here getting to your point. So his story is that dividing labor leads to increasing production. Increasing production, other things held equal, means what happens to the prices? Prices go down. If prices go down, that means more people can afford things, which means the standard of living goes up. So at the beginning of The Wealth of Nations, the division of labor is this great boon. It's this great benefit to humanity. By increasing the supply and quantity of goods, more and more people, including poor people, can afford them. This is a great good for humanity. That's at the beginning of The Wealth of Nations. Then in Book 5, we have these worries, where he says, in fact, what can happen if you have a worker who's spending, as he says, his whole time, all of his waking hours, doing the same monotonous thing after another. You're putting the head on the pin over and over and over again. If that's all you're doing, Smith has some very strong words. He says that such a worker can become as stupid as it is possible for a human being to become. And he continues in that vein. The intellectual torpor of his mind renders him even less praiseworthy than a coward in battle, and it goes on and on and on. It's very bad, very bad sounding language. So this is this is a worry that Smith had. So your question is, well, is this something we have to worry about with capitalism?
Right.
And I think it's something we have to address. And there are other readings in this collection that also addresses it. But one of the easy things I think you can say about it is that what that's not capturing is what the increasing standard of living that comes along with this division of labor enables people to do. So as standards of living rise, that means that for each individual, including the workers at the lowest level, they have to commit fewer of their resources to get the necessaries of life, which means they have other resources now. And that can mean money, but it could also mean time. And that what do you do with that money and time? Well, this is now freeing you to spend that time and money doing other things. And a lot of these other things are the things that really can make life worth living. So, one of the questions that one might ask, and I do, when I teach Adam Smith, people ask me, are you saying, or is Adam Smith saying that money is the only thing that matters? No, that's not what the lesson is. But what wealth can do is enable people to dedicate their time to things that actually do matter to them. I mean, if you're thinking every day, can I eat today? Can my children eat today? Well, what are you not doing? You're not asking yourself, well, what is justice? You're not thinking about, can I be the great artist I would like to be? But having some of those more basic needs met enables you to spend some of the time and resources that you otherwise couldn't spend. You can devote them to things that actually make your life, in a fuller sense, worth living.
Right, and so as agriculture becomes more productive as we specialize, then now there's room for people who might have been unhappy farmers to be happy artists or happy professors or happy students.
Happy professors, are they? Okay.
They're full professors.
Okay, well, once you get tenure, I guess.
Yeah. Now, in his introduction to the book, which I hope you'll all read because I think it's a very interesting collection here, and even if you've read it before, it's always great to kind of go back to these things. I mean, I read a lot of these passages from Smith, fairly regularly because they're so insightful. But as you read the introduction to this, you talk about how there's a kind of tripartite debate. There's a debate between capitalism, socialism, and essentially welfare statism, a mixed economy. And the question you really kind of ask us to consider is, which of these basic systems, and they're kind of ideal types in a way, right? Which of these basic systems delivers the goods, so to speak, in terms of material prosperity? And you've heard Smith's answer. He thinks that capitalism will help promote the division of labor and so forth. But I really want you to talk now about the evidence. And you mentioned what the Scots family might be and what they might have to go through. But there's a hockey stick, and it's not the Al Gore's hockey stick, right? There's a hockey stick in which you really see a takeoff of human material well-being. So what does the evidence say about what caused that, or about which of these systems that you have in this tripartite debate will actually work at delivering that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And here I'm happy to say that we're finally able to get some empirical evidence to address this question. So if you look at the wealth production across the world, so if you take the total world wealth production and divide it by the number of humans in it, and we have pretty good data going back. In fact, there are some economic historians who think we can get data on this going back 1 million years ago. So Brad DeLong says we can make estimates 1 million years ago to early hominids on the planet. That's a little sketchy, but there's pretty good evidence and general consensus among economic historians that we can go back at least to about 10,000 years before, so 12,000 years ago, 10,000 BC, which was a pretty important time in human history because that's about the time that we started farming for the first time. So if you keep the dollar values constant, so use constant purchasing power parity, worldwide wealth production divided by the number of people on the planet, and you graph it, what do you see? Well, the graph it's very low and straight, and then all of a sudden it does this. So all the way through, from 10,000 years ago, all the way through until about 1800 or so, give or take a few decades, then all of a sudden the overall worldwide wealth begins to increase to levels completely unprecedented. Never seen anything like it in human history. So, I mean, that's an interesting thing to think about. So if you run your mind back across some of the great civilizations, human civilizations, so you think about the pharaohs when they were building the pyramids, didn't they generate wealth? Or you think about the Roman Empire, wasn't wealth being generated? I mean, they built the Colosseum, wasn't wealth being generated? Or you think about the Song dynasty, so going into 900, 1000, 1100, you think about some of the great dynasties of China, wasn't wealth being created? Look at the things they were doing. Well, what was happening during a lot of those periods is that the answer is no, generalized wealth wasn't being created. How were they able to do what they were doing? Well, through some of the tried and true methods of human history, which is what we might call extraction. So imperialism, theft, slavery. So how did human beings, have human societies traditionally, so before 1800, how have they become, have they procured the wealth that enabled them to do things like build pyramids and build Colosseum? It was basically on slave labor, so stealing the labor, stealing the things from other people. When one group of people got enough military might, they would just conquer others and take their stuff. But that's a zero-sum game. That's not a creation of generalized wealth. So that's the way I become wealthy in that scenario is I just take it from you. But what you lose, what I gain is what you lose. So it's a zero sum. What began to happen for the first time in human history, now, I say it's around 1800 or so, but this can give and take a little bit.
Yeah, there are others who say it's earlier, but...
1750, maybe even 1700, you see some of the beginnings of it. But what began to take place was that there was a generalized, and maybe it was a cultural shift, a generalized view that the way in which human beings should generate wealth is instead of just commanding it from someone, stealing it from someone, killing people and taking their things, they should trade. Voluntary trade. So if you have something I want, the way I should get it is by offering you something you want, so that when we exchange, it's not a zero-sum exchange, it's a positive-sum exchange. I mean, think of this in just very simple terms. When you go to Starbucks and you say, I want the double mocha latte with syrup or whatever, so it costs $5. So I like to ask my students this. They give you the double mocha latte, you give them the $5. Which of you benefits from that? Well, the answer is both. You both do. You both benefit. And we know that that's the case because if they didn't value the $5 more than that mocha latte, they wouldn't have given it to you for $5. And similarly, the same is true for you. If you didn't value the mocha latte more than your $5, you wouldn't have exchanged for it. But the fact that both of you voluntarily parted with what you had for what the other person had, that means each of you, from your own perspective, benefited from it. Now, this is so for us today, living in, well, maybe not so much Washington, I guess, but living in the West in the 20th century, the 21st century, this is so common we don't think about this very much. But this is a very different way of associating with other human beings from almost all of human history. So when you hear when the question is asked, well, what wins, capitalism, socialism, or welfare state, those terms have a lot of baggage. Not many people want to call themselves or be called capitalists because that sounds kind of bad. Similarly, not many people want to think of themselves as being social or be called socialist because that's usually meant as a pejorative term. But if you put the terms aside and just think about who's making the economic decisions, are the economic decisions being made centrally by some centralized group of experts or authorities, or are the economic decisions being made individually, decentrally by private parties? Under that second regime, where people are making decisions decentrally, individuals are making decisions about where to put their time, talent, and treasure on their own. It's that set of institutions, including cultural institutions, that has led to the enormous increase in human prosperity.
Okay. Well,
it's the only one. So we've tried just about everything else, and it seems to be. I mean, I think you can adopt. I think it's appropriate here at a Hillsdale institution. It's appropriate to adapt a Winston Churchill quote. People sometimes say, "Is capitalism? Are you saying capitalism is the best form, or is it perfect?" Capitalism is by no means perfect. There is no set of human institutions that's perfect. And you might say that capitalism is the worst of all the institutions except for all the other ones. And so given the imperfect nature that we have and the kinds of, the condition of humanity, it has been the only one that has enabled hundreds of millions and now billions of people to rise out of historical norms of poverty.
Okay, so sure, we have more of the stuff we get at Walmart or Starbucks. That's all fine and good.
Yeah.
But won't the critics, including some of the critics that are in your book, wouldn't they say there are other values than material well-being, and how does capitalism do on those? How does it do in terms of virtue? How does it perform when it comes to equality? How does it perform, when it comes to order or security? How does it perform even in terms of liberty when capitalism is perverted by crony capitalism? So how does capitalism stack up in these other areas?
That's a lot of questions.
Well, let's just take virtue. You hear conservative critics will say, capitalism leads to an erosion of the virtues. It's something that kind of eats itself from within in terms of the soul, if you will.
Yeah. So maybe I'll adopt a criticism that's from one of the readings in the book. So Karl Marx, if you've read the Communist Manifesto, I would encourage you that the Communist Manifesto, which everybody should read just for historical purposes, for no other reason, but that's not his most trenchant criticisms of capitalism. He has some other stuff that I think is actually deep. I mean, that's more of a polemical work where he's trying to argue for a political movement. But he has a lot of other interesting stuff. One of the criticisms, I think is one of the most interesting criticisms he raises, is in his commentary that he was writing on James Mill. So James Mill, who was the father of John Stuart Mill, the more famous Mill, wrote an extensive work on political economy, the elements of political economy. Karl Marx is a fairly young man in his 30s, was reading through it, and he wrote notes and commentary on it. And one of the criticisms he raises of what Marx called political economy, but he had in mind something we might today call capitalism, and it's what Marx himself would later call capitalism, was that he thought that built into the fabric of capitalism was lying. So if you think about this, when you go to buy a car, let's say, or if you're going to buy a house, so you say to the owner of the house, well, I will not pay more than this price, and that's a lie. And the owner of the house says, well, I won't take less than this price, which is also a lie. Yeah. And the two of you engage then in this sort of dance where both of you are lying, and each of you knows that the other one is lying too. Now, sometimes you will come to some point where you'll agree and you might execute a deal, but you'd never get rid of the lying. What Marx thought went on in capitalism was that it normalized lying. It said it's okay to lie. It's okay for you to claim that you only want to do, I'll work for you, but I demand this much money. I won't do it for less than that, but that's a lie. Your employer says, well, I won't pay you that much. I'll only pay you this much, but that's probably a lie too. So one of the interesting things that Marx said was that that's not an accidental feature of capitalism. It's not a bug, it's part of the program. So the way capitalism works, and I think you can get this out of Adam Smith. Adam Smith talks about this natural human desire to truck, barter, and exchange. Trucking and bartering. We like to negotiate, we like to haggle. You go to a market and people haggle about things, that human beings seem to like to do that. But the more insidious aspect of it, so even if you think, maybe you're inclined to say, well, it's sort of like, bluffing in poker, that's okay, we all know it's sort of the rules of the game, it's not violating a moral rule. Well, okay, but what Marx thought was that once you get in the habit of telling these sorts of lies, it infects other parts of your soul. It can infect other parts of what should be virtuous activity. So if you agree that honesty is a virtue, which I think it is, but yet for a lot of your life you spend engaging in what you come to think of as being these sort of white lies, this acceptable... Like
when we were in Mexico recently trading with the blanket salesman?
Yes, I don't know what you mean by that. We were at a conference in which we were buying things in Cancun.
And bartering, and it was wonderful,
yes.
right?
But
we were lying.
Yes, well, see, that's... So what Marx thought that would do is it would lead to other compromising of your virtue. So if you're willing to tell lies about things like how much you're willing to work for, or how much you're willing to buy a car for, or a house for, etc., that this can affect other aspects of your life. And I think that's a deep worry. I think that's something to think about. Now, so what would the Adam Smithian, I guess, response to that be? Well, one of them is that there's a limit to what a system of political economy itself would do. So a system of political economy doesn't solve all the problems. In fact, in a sort of surprising way, I think, what it does is it shifts the burden of moral responsibility back where it belongs, namely on you. So what wealth can do, so suppose Smith is right, or the story I was telling is right, that the system of political economy Smith endorsed leads to increasing wealth. Well, and if he's also right, and this is a big if, which maybe you want to ask about, or some of the audience would like to, if he's also right that the government should have a fairly limited role in intervening in the market. So you protect private property, you protect people against assault and theft, and you protect voluntary contracts, and maybe not much else. That's sort of Adam Smith's view. Well, if that's all the government does, well, who's encouraging virtue? Where's the virtue come from? How do we make men moral, right? How do we make men moral? So what Smith thought was that the answer to that question was, instead of it being the institutions that make people moral, it now falls on our shoulders individually, your shoulders and mine. So that all what we can expect, what we can ask out of the system of political economy is to create an arena in which we have both the wealth, but the other part of it, which we haven't mentioned, is the freedom to make choices and be held responsible for those choices. So we're no longer, we can neither get the benefit of the institutions making us moral, but we cannot, nor can we blame them if it goes wrong. It falls only on our shoulders.
Now that's a great segue to talking about another author in here that it really warms my heart to see in here, which is Albert J. Knox. And one of Albert J. Knox's great essays called On Doing the Right Thing. So what does Knox tell us about exactly what you're saying here, about the relationship between freedom and true virtue? Are they at odds for Knox, or is there actually something in which this space you're talking about actually does do that job of making men moral or giving them the opportunity to do the right thing?
Yeah, Knox, if you haven't read that essay on doing the right thing, I recommend it. It's one of the greatest essays, I think, in the English language. It's really fantastic. It's a short essay, so it's not much of a commitment. And you all have it in your book, so you can read it on the subway home tonight or whatever, in your Uber. So what he says in that essay on doing the right thing, he asks this question about what we might today call sort of moral resilience or moral grit. He calls it moral fiber. How is it that people are able to develop what he calls moral fiber? And what he says is that it seems as though that can only happen, that exercising, first of all, it's a skill. It's like judgment. You have to be able to, so knowing what the right thing to do is not a matter of deducing things from first principles, like you're doing mathematics. You have to have this skill of judgment. You might compare it, this is my comparison, not Knox, but you might compare it to driving a car in traffic. You can know the rules of the road, but that won't tell you whether you can pull out now or not, or whether you should try to make this turn or not. It's something you have to practice in order to be able to do well.
Or it's like working out. You have to get your moral muscles
You have
strong.
to develop your moral muscles. So what Knox in that essay suggests is that moral fiber, which is something like sound moral judgment, being able to trust somebody. So if you think about somebody that you know, whose judgment you trust, who you think is a person of sound moral judgment, well, then if you start thinking, well, how did that person get to the point where he or she now has the judgment that you trust?
Right.
What Knox suggests is it's almost always going to be the person had a lot of freedom to make decisions, to exercise that judgment, but the other part of it is had to be held accountable for those judgments. So it's really both of those. In order to develop moral judgment, you have to be able to have the freedom to make choices, including bad choices. I'll speak now only for myself, and I think Knox might have been an atheist or some kind of agnostic in his life. But if you think about, why did God give us free will? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Do you ever wonder why God? So God certainly could, because why is that interesting? Because God must have known, well, at least on the Christian view, God must have known that people would make bad choices. Why allow a world in which people are going to make bad choices? Well, there's something important about this ability to make choices. But the choices themselves have to be, if they're really representative of moral agency, have to also issue in consequences that the person owns. So this is really what that essay that Knox is about.
Right.
Moral fiber develops not just when you're making free choices, but not taking responsibility for them. That's sort of the teenager's ideal life. If any of you have teenagers, or some of you might have been teenagers, maybe some of you still are, they want all the freedom and none of the responsibility. Wouldn't that be a great life? Well, it might seem like it's a great life, but that's actually not a good life.
So it sounds
you want to
like,
have the responsibility as well.
It sounds a lot like what Frank Meyer, one of the fathers of fusionism, said, where he said, essentially, man must be free to be vicious in order to truly be virtuous. That there's an element of that.
I think that's absolutely true. I think there's a deep truth about that.
But what if liberty leads to libertinism? Is that the natural outcome of a society of these free atoms roaming around the world?
Well, liberty sometimes does lead to libertinism, doesn't it? But now I'm going to take a step into I'm going to put my economist's hat, or sort of political economist hat on for a second and say, but what's the alternative? So remember, we're dealing in a world of imperfect creatures under scarcity of resources. So a mistake that we often make, I think, is comparing some imagined ideal. What would the world look like if I could construct an ideal? What would it look like if it were perfect? And then I compare it to the actual world, which of course is found wanting. And the conclusion is, well, therefore we should try to move the actual world more in line with the idealized world. Not necessarily. That argument doesn't quite work. What you have to do is think about what are the actually available potential alternatives. So what you have to imagine is, well, on the one hand, you have a regime in which people can be free to make choices, including good choices, but also bad choices, but be held responsible for those choices, one way or the other. Or a world in which we interfere, we interpose ourselves, maybe either limiting the freedom or limiting the exposure to the consequences, good or bad, either way. What kind of world do we have under those kinds of conditions? So that's a much more interesting question. And so if we're thinking about what the conditions of developing moral fiber or developing virtue are, it seems, and I think this is an argument that I myself would make. A couple of the authors in the book would make this, not all of them would make this, but I myself would make this argument, that you're not going to be able to develop any sense of moral fiber, what I would call moral agency, unless you live in conditions in which you can both have the freedom to choose and be held responsible for those choices, both.
Okay, so capitalism delivers the material goods. Capitalism isn't necessarily something that is a trade-off with virtue. What about inequality, though? I mean, capitalism, a lot of people would think it leads to inequality, and that is per se bad. I mean, what do these thinkers in here say, or what would you say to that argument?
Well, it's true. Conceded. Does capitalism lead to material inequality? Yes, of course it does. I think that can't be gainsaid. In fact, I think it would be hard to imagine a system of political economy that didn't lead to some kind of material inequality. I mean, there have been attempts at that, but almost all of those attempts fail, and for reasons like different human beings are different. Now, for me, that's something to celebrate. We aren't all alike, which I think is fantastic. One of the interesting things about human beings is that they are unique. And they're unique not just in their preferences and their values, but also in the maps, the course of life they want to map out for themselves. I think that's something to be celebrated. Under a system of sort of Adam Smithian political economy, will that mean that some people will have more wealth than others? Yes, that's certainly true. But the trade-off there, I think, is that what you're allowing is a different kind of equality. So you have inequality in material wealth, but in what sense is there equality under that system? And the equality is that each person is accorded respect as an equal moral agent. So we respect you and the choices that you make, including the consequences of those choices, and we do not presume to second-guess your choices, to demand that you ask us permission for your choices. We respect you as a moral agent. Now, sometimes things don't always work out for us. We make mistakes, and there's luck and good luck and bad luck in people's lives. There's no getting rid of that. But there is that sense of equality also. It's an equality of moral agency, or you might think of a moral authority that you can have as being someone who is in charge of his or her own life. And that, I think, is something to be celebrated.
Well, one more question before we turn it over to the audience to ask you questions, and that is, back to your comments about Marx and his concerns about capitalism. So you engage in this seeming fraud, or at least lying or deceit in the market activity. Is business itself, even if it leads to some good material outcomes, is business really a morally good activity to pursue? Or even, let's just say, relative, right? Is it a relatively inferior thing to do than, say, working for a nonprofit or working in public service? In other words, are the soldiers and the postmen and women and the nonprofit workers like myself, are we morally superior to the businessmen and women out there? Because they're engaging in this kind of grubby, activity, or at least its opponents would claim. I don't believe that, but what would Smith say? What would Marx say? What would these authors say? What would you say about that?
Yeah, there does seem to be a kind of cultural consensus in America, I think, that engaging in business, especially if you're successful in, meaning you make money in business, that maybe that must mean there's something morally suspect about what you did.
That's what people say.
I think it's interesting to contrast this. So think about, on the one hand, business as a profession, and compare it to, say, medicine as a profession. So they're both professions in a sense. They have technical expertise, they have specialties, subspecialties. If you want to master them, you have to spend a lot of time in both cases, learning a great deal of information, methodology, technical knowledge. And if you're successful, according to the respective definitions of success, you could make a lot of money. But note this so in those respects, business and medicine are similar, but note which is, I think, behind your question. Note this very different telling, I think, difference between the two. No one says to the medical professional, the medical doctor, well, now that you've made your money, you need to give back to society. But they do say that to the business professional. Now that you've made your money, you need to give back to society. Now think about that for a second. Why would that? What's the culture? What's the view that's behind that? Is it because business people don't give money to charity? Well, that's not true. They do all the time, so that can't be it. Is it because medical doctors are only thinking about other people? Well, they don't work for free, do they? So what really is the difference between those two? And I think that tells us something about the culture. Now, when you raise your children, those of you who have had children, if you say to one of your children, you need to give that back, I mean, when do you say that? You say that when they stole something, right? That's when you say you need to give that back, when they stole it. So when people say business people need to give back to society, it's almost as if they're thinking there's something sinful about that. Now, I take that as a real challenge. So I mentioned right at the beginning that I teach in a business school, and I tell my students in the business school, and even my colleagues, I have said that we need to ask ourselves, is there something really inherently morally suspicious about business activity? Because if there is, so if after we've examined it, and it turns out there's no morally virtuous way to engage in business, there's no such thing as honorable business. If that turns out to be the case, then we should stop teaching business. We shouldn't do it anymore. Because, I mean, think about other sins. You don't say to the thief, well, it's okay as long as you give some of it to charity or something. No, you say stop stealing.
Or that
Stealing
we should
is
have
wrong.
a thief school.
We don't
with a big endowment.
teach you how to steal well. So I think the question of, is there such a thing as honorable business? So business activity that is honorable in itself, not just what it might do afterwards, say by giving back in some way, but honorable in itself, that in some sense is I think, should be the first question at the beginning of business school education. Now, my thought about that is that there is a way to understand business activity that's honorable, and it's connected with creating value for others. If you're not defrauding people, you're not stealing from people, you're not engaging in cronyism and crony capitalism, which, by the way, is just another way of defrauding and stealing from people, using the mechanism of the state to protect you in various ways. If you're not doing those things, but instead are providing, in good faith, value to other people, that, I think, is an important good in itself. Now, if you want to ask me, are there other ways that you could be behaving that would be even better than that? Maybe. I don't know. I'll be an agnostic about that. But that doesn't mean that there isn't something inherently good about honest and what I would call honorable business.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. But let's see what the audience thinks and questions. And feel free to ask on any range of questions related to the subject.
And if you would come to either of the two microphones on either side, we're recording the event, so that's why we'll be able to capture your question. And please just mind the cords on the ground. That's what's causing the loud sounds. Thank you.
There's another side too.
Well, this side is really focused in.
Everybody's on the right.
We are happy to take questions from the left, too, okay? We're ecumenical. Go ahead.
Hi, Matthew Powers with the Institute for Justice. My first question is, in the theory of moral sentiments, what Adam Smith seems to emphasize more is this idea of sympathy as motivating human action and human morality, whereas in Wealth of Nations, he goes more into this idea of selfishness. And I'm wondering if you think Some people propose that the ideas are separate, that in settings where we know people, we'll act more out of sympathy, whereas when we don't know people, we act more out of selfishness. Do you agree with that theory? Do you believe more that the two are somewhat intertwined in a way? And also, as far as defending business as being moral, there's a great essay called Unto the Last, which was an essay that inspired Gandhi, and it gives a pretty good defense of business as being moral.
Thank you for the big question. Since we have several people who want to ask questions, I'll be brief about that. So this is really what you're recapitulating in your question about Adam Smith is the Adam Smith problem, the alleged Adam Smith problem. In the theory of moral sentiments, he talks about sympathy, but what he meant by that was sympathy of sentiments. So what he says motivates us, and he claims this this is supposed to be an empirical claim about human behavior. We're motivated by an interest in seeing our sentiments, whatever they are, echoed in other people. It gives us a pleasure to see that other people agree with us. That's what he called sympathy of sentiment. So it wasn't feeling sorry for other people or even being motivated to do good for other people. He meant it as a hypothesis that this is part of what people are interested in seeing. They like to see their sentiments echoed in other people. In that respect, I think it fits very nicely with the story that we get in the Wealth of Nations, in that what you get in markets is an extension of this interest in seeing your sentiments echoed in other people. Because what happens in markets is that you come into contact with people outside of your own band, outside of your own tribe, all the way on the other side of the world. And this encourages you in a way that maybe even despite yourself, to engage in a kind of community with people, even people you don't know. So although I think it's true, and I think Smith would have agreed that we are to some extent a tribal species, we are a small group species, we evolved in small groups, we tend to feel this very strong pull towards our own kind, and we're suspicious of people outside of our own kind. That may be true on some kind of psychological level. What markets can act to do is to give us an interest, a motivation to deal with people outside of our band in ways that don't include killing them. If we can benefit from them by trading with them, if we have mutual, this now gives me an interest in exchanging with them in a way that's other than just killing them. And I think those two things can actually be united on a very nice, deep level. Thank you for the question.
Yes, Joel Hetker. If Smith were alive today, how would he view the Bitcoin?
How
would he view the Bitcoin?
How would he view the Bitcoin? So Smith, so he's writing at a time when banking institutions and currency were still trying to figure out exactly how these things worked in the 18th century. His good friend David Hume, whom I mentioned earlier on, maybe had a better idea about how this worked than Adam Smith himself. But Scotland, as you may know, was the home for quite a period of time in the world of free banking. So there was actually competitive banking in Scotland, not one fiat currency. Any person could open a bank and issue his own currency, and you had quite a bit of that. You had lots of bank failures, and you had lots of bank successes. Smith seemed, on the whole, to view that favorably. So I think what Smith thought was that currencies could compete with one another like other goods and services. Banks could compete with one another like other companies or other firms and other industries. So if we extrapolated that to the 21st century, would Smith view, say, Bitcoin as a competitive currency that through the magic of competition in a market setting can raise all boats, as a rising tide raises all boats? My guess is he would say yes.
Hi, Casey Given with Students for Liberty. One of the common critiques I hear of Smith from the left is that he misunderstood the outcomes of capitalism. Namely, he thought that capitalism would create generally more equal allocation of wealth, whereas they see it now that we're getting more unequal redistribution of wealth. How would you respond to that?
I don't think Smith thought that capitalism would lead to equal distribution of wealth. What he thought capitalism, he didn't use the term capitalism, so we're speaking a little anachronistically now. But the system of political economy he endorsed, which included things like free trade, free migration, protections of private property, and limited intrusion by the government into economic activities. What he thought the results of that would be generation of prosperity. It would increase prosperity. So he didn't have any particular illusions, but he also didn't have any particular interest in ensuring a kind of equal distribution of wealth. What he wanted for there to be was increasing prosperity, because he thought that opportunity rose with prosperity. So the more prosperity there was in the world, the more opportunity that people would have to chart their own courses for life. He was much more concerned about equality of this, what I was talking about a minute ago, about equality of moral agency. So one of the things that he thought was deplorable about life for many people in his day was that depending on the social class you were born into, your rights and privileges could be severely restricted or limited. So if you wanted to open a business, you had to go to the lord or the baron or whoever the authority was and ask permission. Now just think about that. You had to beg on your knees for permission to lead your life the way you wanted to lead. That was a kind of moral inequality that he thought was deplorable. We put everybody on a moral level, so you have just as much right to lead your life according to your own lights as anybody else does. That was the kind of moral equality, the kind of equality that he thought was morally praiseworthy. He was much more interested in that. Almost the icing on the cake, as it were, was that the kinds of institutions that would allow for that moral equality would lead to this, what he speculated, and it was a pretty bold speculation in the 18th century, speculated would lead to an unprecedented generation of wealth, which would, so it was almost the icing on the cake. But as far as equality goes, he was much more interested in this moral equality.
And he was concerned about the problem of poverty that we started off with.
Right. Which was, for him anyway, a much bigger problem. I mean, I'll ask you this, if I could, excuse me for a second, Nigel, before you ask your question. Let me ask you this question. I ask this of my students, and I also often ask this of audiences. Suppose you could solve one dilemma in society, but only one of the following two. You could solve poverty or inequality. Which would you solve? Well, if your answer is poverty, that's the answer that Adam Smith would give. Poverty is a much greater cause of misery for human beings than the fact that some people have more than others. I mean, if Bill Gates walked into this room right now, then the inequality in the room would skyrocket. But the fact that he happened to be physically present wouldn't have actually changed your situation or my situation. The problem with poverty is poverty. The problem with being poor is that you don't have the things that enable you to lead the kind of life that you might otherwise want to lead. That's the problem. It's not that somebody else has more. It's all of the difficulties that poverty poses. So I think the Smithian answer would be, let's solve that problem first, and then once we solve that problem, or attempt to solve that problem, then maybe we can turn our attention to other things.
And that's really what's key, it seems to me, is that he's getting out of a world of zero-sum mercantilism to a world of positive-sum trade.
Right.
Yeah, Nigel Ashford, Institute for Humane Studies. Surveys suggest that a majority of young Americans have a critical view of capitalism, and up to 40% of them prefer socialism. Why do you think that is?
I'll resist speculating about motives. I think it's partly because maybe a more charitable view or a less critical view is that they're not really sure what those words refer to. So capitalism sounds like people being greedy SOBs, that term. Socialism sounds like we care about the poor. So if the alternative is, let's all be greedy SOBs, or we're going to care about the poor, which do you want to be? Well, that seems pretty clear. On the other hand, if what we're talking about is, well, let's actually look at competing systems of political economy as they have played out in human history, and let's start comparing. Well, then I think the question becomes much more interesting and also much more dispositive. But that requires some work. You have to actually go pay attention, go take a look. You have to read a few things. So ask people about, we're referring particular to the millennial generation. Well, ask millennials, so many of my students are millennials, maybe some of your students, maybe some of you are millennials. Ask your average millennial, tell me everything you know about the Soviet Union. Well, you get maybe not even a full sentence. It happened in Russia? What century was it? Not really sure. What went on? Not really sure. Well, that's indicative of a much larger problem of education that we don't have to talk about now. But I think one of the reasons why is because people just don't know the histories. They don't have a historical sense of what actually happened in these places. What's the difference between North Korea and South Korea? What's the difference between, say, Cuba and Little Havana, Miami? Why is it that Hong Kong has done so well, and what is it that's led Hong Kong to have such a spectacular increase that started you can almost pinpoint the date when it began? They don't have a historical sense about this. And one other aspect, if I may, that I think is important is that remember that those of us living in America today, we have at our fingertips wealth that was unimaginable to people only a couple of generations ago. So we're born, raised, and live in what, historically speaking, is spectacular wealth. I think a lot of younger people can be forgiven for thinking that that's just the natural course of things. Wealth just magically gets generated. They have what I sometimes disparagingly call the milk comes from the grocery store theory of economics. Where do the new iPhones come from? From the store. Why is there constant innovation? It just happens. Well, no, it doesn't just happen. It turns out that the institutional structures that enable that kind of innovation, the prosperity that we've been able to enjoy, are remarkably rare, but they're also remarkably fragile. They can go away very quickly. So that's all part of, I think, a sort of larger educational mission that, by the way, I applaud the Institute for Humane Studies for engaging in, for taking part in that. But one reason, I think, is that people just don't have that historical perspective. They don't really know what these human experiments have resulted in and why we have the things we do now and why other places don't. They haven't studied it, which is why they have to read Adam Smith.
Right. Well, it's also unless they went to Hillsdale College, right?
Of course.
Yeah, my name's Paul London. I wrote a book a few years ago at the American Enterprise Institute on the way competition changed actually inflation in the United States in the 80s and 90s. But I also was in the Clinton administration. I probably ought to be at that microphone. But I looked in your book, and I always look in the index, and I looked, in the Wealth of Nations, I looked in the index, and you see all the different industries, the 80 or so industries that Adam Smith knew about. I looked in your index to see government. What was the role of government? Mm-hmm. And it referred to state, and then I looked at state, and there's really almost nothing about it. It seems to me that in this town, the big argument is over the role of government in the economy. And I think Smith had a very important role for government. That is, he keeps talking about how people are trying to break down competition. He wants competition. He wants what you want and what I want. But he recognizes that businessmen don't want this. When they get together, they try to fix prices and, all sorts of other things. They try to keep other people out. It can be, so there's a very big role for government. He's writing this book for legislators, and he's telling them to break up all these monopolies that existed around. So there's a very big role for government. And it seems to me, judging by your index, you haven't discussed that very much, and I wonder if you would.
Yeah, I think you're mischaracterizing Smith's view on the role of government. So he was not an anarchist. So there was a government. He wasn't even, say, a Robert Nozikian or Ayn Randian libertarian. He thought the government had to be robust enough to protect people's persons, property, and private and promises, he called it, or contracts, voluntary contracts. And he also envisioned a role of government in what he called some select public works, which is other major criterion, which is maybe partly what you have in mind. Although the standards you had to meet in order for something to count as a public work that the government should provide were pretty high. It had to be something that benefited the entire country, not one group at the expense of another group. And it had to be something that couldn't be provided by private enterprise. It had to be both of those. So if you start thinking about, well, what things could private enterprise not provide, it might not be all that many. But in any case, he did think that he was at least open to that possibility. But the part of your point where I think you're mischaracterizing Smith is about monopolies. So when he talks about businessmen getting together, they can barely get together for a few minutes before the conversation turns to how they can start sticking it to the public by price fixing and cartels and various other things. The problem that he identifies there is not that they're talking about that. They can go ahead and try to fix prices. The problem only comes when they enlist their friends in the government to enforce by law their price fixing. So when they the monopolies arise, he thinks, precisely, not naturally, but they arise when they're given charters. So one company gets a charter to trade. A group of companies, the important families, get protections from competition. They get subsidized through the general purse for losses. That's all of the distortion of the market and the problem that comes in. So the solution, the way to address it, it's not quite a solution, but the way to address it, Smith thought, was simply to so if you have 5 or 6 people, and you probably know that, you have 5 or 6 companies that decide they want to fix a price on something, voluntarily, not using the government to help them, but they voluntarily do it, that's a very unstable market, because it's always in the incentive of any one of them to break away from that and start, so they all collude together, they want to raise the price. One of them says, well, but I can do it for just a little bit less, and so these things unravel very quickly. So Smith was actually quite optimistic that in the long run and overall, decentralized markets would tend to militate against these sorts of like monopolies, for example. He thought the real problem came when you got these protections that were written into law and had the authority of law, because those the market couldn't fix those. Those were permanent or semi-permanent. That was the real problem he thought.
And he didn't want government to break them up. I think that it sounds to me very much like that's what he wanted. He wanted government to break up these.
No, I think other people after Smith talked about an important role of government breaking monopolies up. But Smith himself thought that this was a problem that he was optimistic about this. Maybe you think he was naively optimistic, but that this was a problem that could resolve itself if we continued to make sure that nobody got special protections from the government. Nobody got special, this is the cronyism question. Right. We make sure there's no cronyism going on, and then some companies will fail. And that's part of the creative destruction of the market.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for the formal session, but we can still continue this conversation informally amongst each others. I want to thank Hillsdale College for hosting us, and I also want to thank the Charles Koch Institute's events team for doing a wonderful job at providing this venue for a good discourse on these important works, and I really appreciate all the questions, including the last one, because I think it's really great to start a dialogue about what capitalism is, what are the arguments of the critics, what are the good arguments on either side of these debates, so that we can move forward to continue our search for the truth about how different types of societies arrangements can lead to greater well-being. So I'm really appreciative of all you for coming, so thank you.
Thank you.